All right. Hello and welcome to our session. Now you see it, taking access control and viewing permissions into your own hands. My name is Douglas Hemphill. I am one of the campus instructional designers, and I'm joined today by Carrie Mocyk, our other campus instructional designer, and we're going to get started. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Now, basically, one of the primary functions of the LMS system is obviously presenting students with information and assessment, but also controlling how and when they see that. Uh, so to start with, what we're going to look at is actually at the highest level, do students see your course? Well, in Brightspace on your homepage, when you look at your list of courses, you will see an inactive tag on any course that students cannot see. So they do not see anything. It is completely hidden from them. Once a course is opened, that tag just disappears. And to open a course, the easiest way is simply to go into that course and go into Course Tools and Course Admin and go to your course offering information. And if you scroll down about halfway, you'll see this active option. Simply place a check mark there and save it. And as soon as you do that, the course becomes active. Now, just as a heads up, on the institutional homepage, that tag may take a few minutes to clear after you hit that button, but as soon as you've checked that box and clicked save, students will be able to access the course. So that's kind of the highest level. So let's get into our actual course, and we're going to go into content. And the most basic way to hide anything is to simply hide it, which is done via these eyeballs. So you'll see I'm in my first module. My eyeball is right up there, and I can make something hidden or unhidden. And if it is hidden, I get this little notification underneath it. The other option is I can always do it from the pull-down menus. So if I grab the pull-down menu here, I see the option to hide from users. Now, when you're dealing with individual items, this can occasionally be a little harder to find, so I do tend to use the pull-down buttons. But you see that if I edit properties in place, then I get the eyeball again. And if I am actually inside of an item, at least a content item, you'll see at the bottom, I have that little eyeball as well. So you'll see that hanging out in a lot of different places. But if you ever can't find it, simply use the pull down menu and simply hide something from users or make it visible to users. So that is really the most basic option. The next level of options is date releasing. And as with the hiding option, there's a couple different places you can do this. For most content, you can edit the properties in place and add dates through there. And that's as simple as clicking, okay, I want to add a start date and I want to add an end date. However, if you're actually in the edit screen, okay, I'm not seeing the screen I was expecting to see. Sorry about that. They've been changing the interface up a little bit. And so we've run into a few cases where things aren't quite where we expect them to be. Interesting. Okay, so they've made it now so that you need to use that edit properties in place to get to those dates and restrictions. Now, this is just for content items. If you're talking about assessment items, those have a slightly different interface. However, they have been working to make all of the assessment interfaces basically look the same. So we're going to look at assignments, but this should basically be the same for quizzes and will be the same for discussions as soon as they implement the new discussion interface. So I'm going to edit my assignments. And on the right-hand side, I have the option for availability, dates, and conditions. And I'm simply going to expand that. And you see I have the ability to add a start date. And I have an ability to add an end date. And it's as easy as that. Now, by default, the way these dates work is that they give students what I would call a preview of what is coming. So back in content, if I put a date release on something, as a student, what I will see is simply the name of whatever it is. Whether it's quiz, an assessment, anything like that, I cannot go into it. However, assessments have a little bit more flexibility in that. In terms of when I set a date, you'll see under the date, I now have new options. And this tells me, okay, how do I want this date to function? So the default is visible with access restricted, which simply means that I can see the link, I can't go into it. Or I can let them go into it, but the submission button has disappeared. Or I can hide it from them completely, so they simply do not see it. Pardon me. Now, for assignments, I don't think the ability to go in and look at the instructions is a big issue one way or the other. But where I find this more useful is in discussions, because I may want the discussion to be over and not to allow submissions anymore, but I may want my students to be able to go in and still read the discussion. And so that's a great chance to use the secondary option where it's visibility with submissions restricted. And again, even though I'm in an assignment right now, these options should basically stay the same. Now, maybe I don't want to have to click that date button every single time. So, or sorry, that setting underneath the date button. So what I can do is go to course admin, and I've got availability date defaults. And what this lets me do is for every single assignment, I can change the default. So I can change it to, well, I don't want them to see the assignments before they start, period. And for the discussions, I want the visibility, or oops, I don't want them to see my discussion question ahead of time, but afterwards, I do want them to be able to go in and read what other people have posted. So you do have that ability to set things on a high level for the defaults. Just be aware this does not change dates that have already been created. It only works for new dates. And then also on the topic of date releases, since we're in course administration, one of our favorite tools is manage dates. And this will show everything in the course, so every single date, and gives you the ability to change these dates on the fly. The way I tend to use this when I'm looking at a course is I use this full view to do a really quick scan to see, okay, is everything in the right year? You know, nothing's from a previous semester. But then I usually change it over to specific tools to look at things like discussions only, and especially when I'm creating new dates. I find it much easier to grab all my discussions and add in my dates. Now, the last thing I'll say is that you do not need to have both a start and end date. You can have just a start date and you can have just an end date, or you can have both. Either is perfectly fine. Now, if you are using folders in your main system, so in content on the left, if I hide this folder with a date release, that hides everything in the folder regardless of whatever due dates regardless of whatever end or start dates they may have. So whatever the highest level is will override everything else. The other place that you tend to see this is in discussions. The way discussions work is you have what they call a forum, which is really just a box to put discussion topics in, but the forum has the ability to set dates on it. And again, this interface is going to be changing to look more like the assignment interface. But if I put a date here, this will override any date that I have on the actual topic. And worse still, I do not see this date anywhere except in the discussion aggregator. So I'd encourage you not to put dates in the discussion forum. Use the topics directly. So the next thing I want to talk about is special access. So this is easiest to see on assignments and discussions and tests. When I go into my availability system, I will see something called special access. And this simply gives one particular user or a group of users the ability to see this outside of the rest of the class. So I can have one set of start and end dates. And let's say I know somebody missed this because of a funeral or something like that. I can simply go to manage special access. And you're generally going to want to use the first option. If you use the second option, nobody can see this unless they have special access. And usually you're just trying to change who can see it and how. Then I just add a student. I set up my properties so I can set up different start and end dates. And then I just say who this applies to. And I click save. And it tells me, okay, this student has this specific access, and I can edit or delete that using the commands right on the right side. So I'm going to save and close that. And now on my main screen, it will tell me there is one user that has special access. Now, it's a little different for content items, i.e. stuff that's presenting information, so your pages and stuff like that. In those cases, to get to that interface, what you need to do is use the pull down and edit properties in place, and that will give you this link for add dates and restrictions. And now you see I have manage exemptions. That is not the page I was expecting to see. Okay, sorry, they switched things up on me again. Um, I'll have to look into that as to why I can't do special access for the items. Again, I apologize. We just had a update and they changed a few things. Moving on from that, though, the next thing I want to talk about is release conditions. So let's say that I don't want my students to be able to view Module 2 until they have done something specific in Module 1. So in this case, let's say I want them to have submitted this sample assignment, and I'm just going to change the name of this really quickly so I can make sure I can find it. So what I would do is go to the module that I want to appear after students have done certain things. And under the module options, I am going to click add dates and restrictions. And this time I'm going to look for release conditions. And I'm going to create a new one. And I've got a whole ton of different options for release conditions. You see, I can do it based on students completing checklists, students visiting specific pieces of content, students participating in discussions, etc., etc., etc. But in this case, what I want is I want this to appear after a student has submitted work to that assignment that I was just looking at. And for some reason, they call them folders here, but it's an assignment, and I want a submission to that assignment. And then it's just going to ask me, okay, what assignment do you want them to have submitted to? And I'm going to grab that assignment that I just created and create this release condition. And it tells me right there, students will not be able to view this folder until they have submitted work to that folder. There's also ways that I can set multiple conditions. So I could say, okay, you either have to submit to something to this folder, or maybe I want you to be able to opt out. So I'm going to say that your other option is that you have gotten a greater than or equal score. Actually, I'll just change this to equal to make it easy. That I want you to have gotten 100 on some sort of pre-test quiz. And if you do that, you don't have to do the assignment. And then I would just change this to any conditions have been met. So now students will be able to see this folder if they submit their assignment or if they got a 100% on a specific quiz. So once you get used to it, it is a very intuitive and easy to use system, in my opinion. Last thing that's always really important, make sure you hit update. If you don't hit update, none of that will have been saved and you'll have to redo it. And then again, it just gives you a quick overview. Okay, this is what you did. Now, I did this at the folder level. I can do exactly the same thing at the individual item level. Again, I just edit properties in place. I add dates and restrictions, and there's my option to create release conditions. Now, one somewhat unique release condition is under content. Did students visit or complete a content topic? Well, I don't necessarily want my students to just click through everything. So what I'm going to do is change my content type or my condition type to completed a content topic. And I'm going to say they have to have completed this particular one. And again, if I wanted them to do everything in a module, I could create a condition for each item in the module. But then what I am going to do is, and I'm going to do this at the top level, I'm going to set the completion criteria for everything in the folder, and I'm going to require it to be manual. So in this case, as a student, what I would have to do is go in and I'm getting too many hiding conditions, so let me do this in a different folder. And note that I can do this at an individual level as well. What the student now sees and I managed to grab something that was already hidden after going through the trouble of trying to avoid that. So let me do that again. So now as a student, you see that I actually have a manual checkbox. So I'm taking responsibility as a student to say, yes, I have read this, I have completed this, and I am essentially saying that, yes, I have done that. If that is not turned on, then the system just does its best to say, okay, a student has visited this. I'll give them an automatic check mark. Okay. The same option holds true for quizzes, discussions, and assignments that I can control their access the same way. The only thing is in this case now it's under availability and dates. And right there I have the option to add a release condition. From here it works the same way. So in this case, I want, based on what I was just talking about, I can find where it was. I want the student to have visited all the content topics. Well, we'll just do one content topic. So I want the student to have visited that, and then this quiz will not appear to the student until they have visited that. And again, this works exactly the same way for assignments, and it should work the same way for discussions once the new update for discussions comes down. So the last way that we really deal with controlling content is through groups. So we go to groups. And there's really two ways of looking at groups. One is that I want groups to be separated for project work. So I want group one to have access to their material, group two to have access to their material without seeing what each other is doing. The other option would be, well, I have several students that require special needs or other accommodations, and I just want to put them all into a group for convenience sake. So the way this works is I will create a new group category. And in this case, I'm going to create a special access group. So this will just be my group for extra time. And I'm going to make this just one group. Note there is also an option for single user member specific groups. That's a little different. I find it easier to just create one group. You don't really need to worry about the restrictions. This is just what the group names actually are. And then I just make sure that it is actually not visible to students. So I don't want students to know who else is in the group in this case. So I'm not going to check that option. And in this case, since I'm not specifically looking for this to be used as assignments, I can ignore that. And I can simply save this. And I'm going to go in and add one person to that group. Actually, let me add two people because I wouldn't bother going through the trouble of creating a group if there was only one person that needed it. And now on any sort of item, too far. I can do my standard edit properties in place. Once you've got dates, you'll lose that option to add dates and restrictions. It'll just appear as a date. So if you just click on the date, it'll pull you into this screen. And again, I'm going to either create a I'm going to create a release condition. And in this case, I'm going to say, okay, only people in a specific group can access this. And this is the group that I just created. So now only that person can access this group. I could also do this through manage exemptions. The main thing is that I can't do it as a group setting here. I have to select the individual students. The same thing basically applies to a quiz. So when I go to availability dates, I can manage special access. And you'll see in this case, I can actually sort my users by group. So I still have to select them individually, but I can say, okay, I only want to see people from group 1, and then I select them. Or again, I can use the release conditions, create a new one, and do it from the roster with group enrollment. Now the other option that I was talking about is making what we'd call group discussions or group assignments. So I want certain students to be working together and I don't want them to see the other students' work. And so you would go ahead and create a group as normal. I have a couple groups around. Let me find one that's okay, so just trying to find a good group to use for this. Okay, So we'll use the project 3 group. So what I do is go to, for example, discussions, and when I edit the discussion, or when I create the discussion initially, they move stuff on me again. So just give me 1 sec. Now, let me try to do this a different way. Hmm. Sorry, they literally just changed my they just did the update to the new version of the discussions, and now I'm not seeing the options that I'm used to.
Doug, what were you looking for?
I'm looking for the option to change it into a oh, okay, I got it.
Okay.
Okay, so the group discussions option is now under availability dates and conditions. I go down and there's a new option for group sections and restrictions. So I click that, and within here, first of all, it's I've got 2 options. The first one is users can view this topic in all of its threads. The second is users in specific sections can view this topic, but only for their own group members. So for the example I was using, where I want each group to have their own discussion forum, I would use the second option and simply select the group that I wanted to use. So this means that so the group project 3 is made up of 3 groups, and each of those groups will now have their own unique discussion forum, and they won't be able to see the other group's discussion forums. So let me see if I can do this on the fly with a real one. Now, the one thing to be aware of is that you will not be able to use this option once posting has started. So this has to be set up before students have started posting. But now I can see this as a group discussion. And when I go in, I have the option to see everything going on, or I can look at just the groups from just the posts from each particular group. Um, in assignments, if you have a group assignment, it works somewhat similarly. Except that it lives in a different place. So under submissions and completions, you have the ability just to turn it into a group assignment. You assign the group. And in this case, there's no real hidden magic. When one person submits it, it counts for everybody. And when you grade the submitted assignment, that feedback gets pushed back to every student. And that is really everything that I have. So the takeaway from this is that there are a lot of different ways to control how students see their work. And it can go from the extremely simple to where you just manually turn things on and off to the extremely complex where you have cascading releases where you have to do this so that this opens up, so that this opens up, so that this opens up, etc. And then on the other hand, you have the group settings, which make sure that members of a specific group only see things related to their group. Generally speaking, you can use the view as student to make sure that these options are working, but a lot of these options are tied to having to do something in specific. So the student view works really well for things for basic hiding. Basically, are my due dates hiding, or sorry, my release dates hiding things the way I want to? Are the things that I want students to access able to be accessed. But the one thing that is missing from the student view is an ability to really enroll yourself in a group. So it's somewhat lacking in terms of making sure that groups are working. If you have questions about that or you have concerns about whether a group is working, just drop in on the instructional designers and we have ways of checking it a little bit more in depth. So, as always, if you have questions or need assistance, we are always available at help@oswego.edu. Or you can drop into our regularly scheduled office hours, which you can find at oswego.edu/DLE, and then click on the help and support option on the right, and you will see our office hours and the office hour link. There's also a lot of documentation there if you feel brave and want to take on things yourself. And when we're not around, so on weekends or late at night, you also have the option to use the SUNY online help desk, and they can usually give you some assistance as well. So with that, I thank you all. And are there any questions?
I think we're good.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I know that one's a bit of a rabbit hole, so hopefully it didn't
No, I thought it was great. It was great.